Hey, everybody, and welcome back to Detections with your hosts, Understudy 77, and
Exiled Atreides.
I hope everybody is having a good night tonight. Tonight is actually kind of an interesting night. It's a bit of a first for us, right, Exile?
Yeah, definitely not a bit of a first. It's a solid first.
Close. Yeah. I mean, there's some parallels to some old episodes, but tonight is really the first time that we're sitting down to talk to an enterprise product vendor.
Yeah, we're popping our enterprise vendor cherry.
Right? And there's some reasoning behind this. So, like, first off, we have said for a long time, like, we want to make sure that access to information is free, but we also want to be able to talk to everybody about really cool stuff. This is a vendor who makes a tool that I think is just phenomenal in the analytical space. Probably one of the most useful tools that I've ever used. So I was really excited when they agreed to jump on and chat with us about it, because I just think it's phenomenal and we want to spread the word a little bit. And also there's some really cool parallels that we can draw in, like, you know, startups and all this different kind of stuff in, like, running big companies or small companies or whatever the case may be as we go through this.
And what I really like too is this will help to show that not all open source is necessarily the best, and enterprise isn't always necessarily the best, but there's good on both sides of that traditional religious debate.
100%. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Ed Dorsey from Polarity. He is the CTO and one of the co-founders. Hi, Ed.
Hey, Michael. Hey, Sean. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. So in general, we always start out with, tell us a little bit about you, where you come from, what you do, you know, all that stuff. Let people get an idea of who you are.
Sure. So I, going back a little bit, you know, my academic background is in computer science and security informatics. And I came out of school and I joined the government. I was an analyst, an intelligence analyst, working to inform U.S. policymakers about foreign cyber threats to U.S. infrastructure. That's what I did. And, you know, diving in a little bit deeper there, I spent a lot of time building analytic tools for analysts. I spent a lot of time taking raw data and figuring out how to extract intelligence from it, and then how to tell a story from that intelligence. And in my case, those stories were going to policymakers. And so spent some time there, actually met our co-founder, one of the co-founders at Polarity, Paul Batista, who I work with now, who's our CEO. And we decided to start Polarity, the company, back in 2014.
So before we get into the history of that a little bit, let's first kind of tee up, like, what is Polarity? Like, I can wax poetic about it, but it's probably better coming from you to tell people, like, what it is and what it does.
Yeah. So Polarity is a desktop application. It's designed for analysts. As a company, we're really focused on helping analysts with their decision-making process. And what the tool does is it uses computer vision to recognize the text on your screen in real time, and then we automatically overlay contextual data related to what you're currently looking at. So as an example, if you have a log file up and that log file contains an IP address, we would recognize that IP address on your screen, and then we would highlight it and let you know that that IP address exists in some third-party data sources, or maybe you've taken a note or an annotation on that IP address, and we would make you aware of that as well. So essentially what the product is doing is it's giving data awareness to analysts so that the analyst can really focus on telling that analytic story, figuring out what the analytic judgment needs to be, rather than going around and collecting data.
It also has a lot of really interesting, like, quick task abilities. So, like, I want to do a virus total search, or I want to do a whois, or I want to get information on something really quickly. I can do that. And I can just go, hey, like, show me all this information in the side. And then I don't have to have 7 or 8 tabs open and look at those things.
That's right. We have what we call the overlay window. It's a kind of a small little desktop window that, you know, a lot of analysts will float over on one of their screens, and it's kind of always on top. And so whatever tool you're currently working on, we're able to enrich that tool by bringing in information. Some of that information might be enriching your application automatically, and other times the analyst can say, hey, you know, I want to run that virus total search now, or that reversing lab search now, and we pull that information in. But the key is we make it really easy to do without forcing the analyst out of their existing workflow or out of their existing tool.
Yeah, and one of the ways that I've kind of, you mentioned the annotation thing. One of the ways that I've kind of described that in, you know, in places that I've been that use the tool is it's this concept of, like, taking all that tribal knowledge and being able to put it in a shared spot that everybody can see. But like, you don't have to go read it. You don't have to memorize it. Just if some of that tribal knowledge happens to hit, you'll be notified of it and it'll let you know it's there. And like, that's a really cool, like powerful thing to have, right?
Yeah, we like to say it's a great place for your tactical notes. So when we talk to companies and our customers, we ask them, where do you keep your notes? Where do you keep those annotations when you're doing an investigation? The answers kind of run the gamut. You've got folks that are putting them into physical notebooks. You've got folks that are typing their notes up in Notepad++ or putting them into Excel. And while that might work for each individual analyst, it becomes very difficult to share that information with your team. And it's almost impossible for your teammates to know when something you've annotated, when some analytic insight you've had about an investigation is related to what they're working on. And so you end up losing a lot of that kind of team coherence when you're not using something like Polarity that can make those connections for you.
Yeah. So, Bill learns something, Bill annotates it and says, hey, I learned this thing. And then Karen's scrolling through stuff and all, like 3 months later, and this thing that Bill learned just pops up and goes, hey, like Bill knows this about this thing. Like, this is worthwhile. It's super cool. So as and I'm sure we'll dive down into a lot of that more as we go, but like, it's really interesting to talk about this stuff in the sense of like, I assume at some point you found a need, right? So like you determined there was a need for something like this. Like, what does that look like? Like, what even brought this whole thing about?
Yeah. So I mentioned, my first career was as an intelligence analyst. And we would commonly run into this problem that we called IP deja vu. So it's the idea, it doesn't have to be an IP address, really any indicator. You see it on your screen, you're working some investigation, you're looking at some data, and you can't help but think it looks familiar. And you spend a bunch of time opening up your search tools, looking across different tools and data sets. Where I was, you would oftentimes have to log into an entirely different system to do that, or maybe even build a system to log into it so that you could do that type of research. And you'd spend a lot of time. You'd start asking your colleagues, et cetera, right? So now I'm wasting my colleagues' time as well. And sometimes you would stumble across that IP address, that hash that you saw a week ago or even before lunch, and you'd be amazed at the marvels of human memory. But oftentimes, you were off by an octet and you just spent a lot of time looking for something that you didn't need to be spending time on. So this IP deja vu problem was really what kind of led us to creating Polarity. And the concept really actually came from Paul Batista, our CEO and a co-founder. And he came to me one day and said, hey, Ed, wouldn't it be cool if you just didn't have to search anymore? What if all the searches were automated based on what you're looking at? And we just pulled back the data for you, right? And so at that point, I said, well, that's really cool, but how are we going to build that?
Cool. So, and then that, I assume, so was this something that you kind of started working on while you were in, the intelligence sector and doing that kind of stuff? Or when did you decide to break off and figure out how to make this work?
So we started having these discussions, actually, we had already formed a company. So, just diving into a little bit of personal life. At this point, I was actually living in Japan, in Tokyo, and Paul had left government to be close to family, to start his own family, and so we were doing consulting work at the time. We were doing IR engagements and security engineering work, and so we were a services company at the time. We were called Breach Intelligence, and we always knew that we wanted to start a product company, and so we were just constantly pitching ideas back and forth about, what that product would be. So this was around 2014. And Paul had come to me with this idea of, hey, what if we used computer vision or real-time OCR? We recognize the pixels on the active application window, we extract the text, and then we pull back notes automatically for the user, right? So if you tagged an IP address, we would automatically pull back that tag and we'd show it to you. My response, of course, to that was that's impossible and it's not going to work. And pretty much poo-pooed the idea. Paul, being a hacker in the truest sense, unbeknownst to me, went off for a couple of weeks, and in the evenings he built this prototype. So about 2 weeks later, he came back to me and was like, Ed, let me show you what I've got here. And he showed me this prototype. He typed in a tag for this IP address, put the IP address into Notepad, and sure enough, this little, it was Windows 7 at the time, and a little tooltip popped up down in the system tray. And it said, you should know that IP address 108.x.x.x is tagged with bad guy. And I looked at that and I thought, wow, that's working pretty well. Maybe we can actually build this product. And so that was kind of the genesis of the idea. It was that initial prototype. It was written in C# using WinForms. It only ran on Windows. And that was the sort of the start point for Polarity.
Nice. And then, so, let's talk a little bit for anybody who may be unfamiliar about that concept of like computer vision or like real-time OCR. Like what is that?
So effectively, folks should be very familiar with OCR, but just probably not in the context of reading your computer screen. It's that application you can run after you scan a document in to convert it into editable text. And what we did was we took a lot of those algorithms are really designed for document scanning. They're not designed for scanning the pixels on your screen. And so a lot of the work that we had to do was figure out how can we efficiently, from a CPU processing perspective, and also accurately figure out the text on your screen. So what we're doing is we're literally taking a screenshot of your application and then working off the screenshot to figure out what the text is in that. We're not scraping the screen. It's not a Control-A copy-paste type operation. It's actually looking at those pixels in the screenshot. And the beauty of that technique is it allows us to work across any application. So think of a PDF that you can't edit. You can't really copy the text out of it. It's a scan. Maybe it's a scanned image. We can still do recognition on that. Or maybe you're in a protected virtual machine. We can still do the recognition on that as well, even though you don't have access to, for example, the clipboard buffer in that virtual machine.
I can actually confirm that you can do recognition off of a GIF in a chat message, which was really surprising to me and really funny at the same time.
Yeah, we do recognition all the time in screen shares, sometimes by accident. It gets a little confusing when multiple people are running Polarity and you're not sure if that's your Polarity highlighting the screen or if that's their Polarity that they're showing you highlighting the screen.
So obviously when you talk about anything that kind of captures the screen that you're on, like we're all security people, right? So a bunch of people are going to have a bunch of potential security concerns with that. So kind of talk about that a little bit, because like that can be really scary to people, right? Like, what does that data look like? Where does it go? Like, put that to rest.
Yeah. So, when we first started as a startup, just kind of talking about being a startup, right? Nobody knows who you are. We were talking to Fortune 100 banks. We were talking to a lot of big enterprises, and they were like, "Hey, who are you guys? You just showed me this cool software, but it looks like it's reading the screen. That seems like a no-go." And actually, just kind of talking a little bit about, no plan survives contact with the enemy. When we first started working on Polarity, we wanted it to be actually a SaaS application. But in meeting with those initial customers, we realized we would have to quickly pivot into making it an on-prem solution. So to answer your question there, the first thing is that the entire platform runs on-premise. It's an enterprise platform. It runs within you as a customer, your own data center. The second thing is that the processing of the screen is actually happening locally on the desktop of the analyst. So kind of one of the neat and cool aspects about Polarity is that all that processing of the image data happens locally. None of that image data is being sent to the server. And furthermore, we don't actually send all the text that we extract. We're able to locally determine whether or not something is got a high probability of being annotated. So, for example, here, just a concrete example, if you had a spreadsheet or a document open full of social security numbers, we're not sending all those social security numbers to that on-prem server. We're actually only going to send them if someone has annotated it, so that we can give you that annotation back.
Is it same with integrations? Like they're looking for specific pattern matches, right? So it's really only scanning for the pattern match and then doing the send from there.
Exactly. Same thing with the integrations. And, a key thing with integrations is that those are controlled by you as a customer. You decide which integrations you want to put on the server. And you can even configure the integrations to not run automatically if you want them to just run when you tell it to run. And again, as an individual user within the Polarity platform, each user is choosing which integrations they want to subscribe to. So you would only turn on the integrations that made sense to you for you to use whatever your role is.
Yeah, it's a lot of individual user power. And I can say from experience that you guys take the privacy aspect of it pretty seriously, almost occasionally. And while I understand why you do it to a frustrating extent, because like if you want to install one of those integrations, you have to like bare metal install it on the server. You can't do it, from a store or anything, because that could compromise some integrity, I'm assuming, at least when you were starting.
Yeah, to be honest, and maybe this goes into a little bit about, building a product as a startup. You're going to have just a ton of ideas that you want to put into a tool when you're building a product, right? And so you have to really optimize or make smart decisions about the features that you're going to add. So we would love to have an integration store in the product. And in fact, that's actually something on the roadmap right now, something that we're going to be working on, because as far as future kind of goals for Polarity, one of them is to build a better community around our integration frameworks. All of our integrations, they're MIT licensed, they're open source, they're up on our GitHub page. We have over 100 of those. But we do want our customers to be able to kind of participate in that community a little bit more in terms of building those integrations and then contributing those back. So as far as the integration store goes, that's definitely a great idea. It's something that we want to do. But when you're kind of working in a startup environment, you're going to have a lot of great ideas. And so you're constantly prioritizing, which one of these things has to get built to have the best experience for that customer. So the integration store was just one of those things that kind of got bumped back a little bit. I think you can absolutely build that in a very secure manner. And we could even have an offline integration store, to your point, right, where we just make it easier to install those through the interface. So, I would say that was maybe not one of the things that was security driven. A lot of the aspects of the platform are security driven, especially the fact that it runs on premise. Integration store just going to, tips for a startup or lessons learned. Sometimes a great feature just has to get kind of kicked down the road a little bit just because you have limited bandwidth and resources as a startup.
Oh, for sure. And that's really fair. And that's a fair clarification for me. So that's a good pivot point though. Like let's talk a little bit about running a startup, because this is your first startup and you came from a very different type of background. So like what was that like, making the transition into startup life?
Very different. Yeah. Going from government into starting your own startup, I think couldn't be, it's a night and day difference there. So, for me, the transition was actually fairly straightforward. And I think a large part of that was because of how good, my co-founders are. So, Paul and Joe Ravella, who's our third co-founder, all of us had worked together, in some form or another professionally. And all of us were also good friends. And so, kind of that first, tip, if you're thinking of starting a startup, is to pick good co-founders. And so I was very lucky to have really great co-founders. These are people that share the same kind of morals that you have, the same sense of ethics, and, very importantly, the same goals, in terms of what they want to get out of the startup itself. If you want, kind of a lifestyle business that you're going to work for the next 20 or 30 years and then retire from, that's a very different goal and path than if you want to start the next billion-dollar publicly traded company. And if your co-founders don't all agree on what that path is going to be, you're going to run into a lot of trouble. So for me, that transition, it wasn't too bad. You end up working a lot more hours. There's some sort of those, just those truisms of having a startup. But, for us, we transitioned into doing services, and we had a pretty healthy a stream of services revenue that we were able to generate that allowed us to bootstrap the company. And so we didn't have to worry too much early on about, investors or raising capital, or any of that, burn rates and those types of things. It was one less kind of stress point for us. So we sort of eased ourselves into it. We didn't just start off from day one as a product company with no product and zero salary and we were just burning tons of money. We went sort of the more conservative approach of bootstrapping the company, giving us some time to figure out what that product was going to be and to develop it and get it to market before we sort of, pulled the lifeline and went all in on it.
And that's actually not a bad piece of advice for people who might think about doing something like that, like taking into account, unless you're partially there because you've been doing it on your off time, like having some stream of revenue is not a bad idea. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, if you have the ability to work in your off time on your idea, that's a great thing too, right? So being able to develop that product as much as you can while you've got that, that stable job and that stable income, that can be very important. Every day of development you can do on that product while you have a stream of revenue is one less day where you don't have that when you finally decide to go all in on the startup idea. You don't have to just, dive right in. There's lots of ways you can kind of ease into it.
So what was the change like? Like you talk about working a whole lot or working a lot more. What kind of challenges do you face in that kind of lifestyle? Not just the lifestyle, but like in specifically trying to bring a product to market.
Yeah. So, you're going to end up working more just because you're so vested in what you're doing, right? So it's not a bad thing when I say you're going to end up working more, because hopefully you're enjoying it. If you're not, then you should probably change your startup idea. If you don't enjoy working in the startup that you started, you should probably find a new idea. It's just you're going to have a hard time being successful because it's, for every story of a startup that goes from zero to exit in 2 or 3 years, there's hundreds of startups that are where that's not going to happen, right? So you should assume it's going to be a marathon and not a sprint. And so you have to kind of still have that work-life balance, even if you are working a lot of hours. But for me, yeah, the founding team and a lot of the folks at the company work long hours, but hopefully everyone's having a fun time doing it. I really enjoy what I'm doing. I really enjoy the people I'm working with. So these aren't really things that are any different, hopefully, for anybody at any job. But I think they just become all the more important when you're in a startup because of how much it's going to consume in terms of being a part of your life.
So another interesting question about that, because, one of the things that people think about when they go, if they think about a startup is like, I'm going to make this product, everybody's going to love it and I'm going to change the world. And I think a lot of times people don't necessarily find that to be the case. So like interesting curiosity, how much of like what ends up getting built at the end of the day outside of kind of the initial idea is driven by potential customers versus how much is driven based on like what you want to do?
So I think as soon as you're trying to sell your product, a lot of what you do is going to be driven by customers. I gave that first example of we wanted to build a SaaS product and we pivoted to an on-prem enterprise product.
That's what made me think of the question.
Yeah, absolutely. So the other thing I would say there, early on when we had this idea for Polarity, one of the discussions we had was how many people should we tell the idea to, right? So Paul had built this prototype. He had showed it to me. We showed it to some of the other folks that were in the company. And, that there was this kind of spirited discussion on whether or not we should be advertising that this is something that we're working on. And we kind of came down on the side of let's show it to everybody that's willing to listen. And so Paul went out and he started showing this prototype and basically pitching the vision, right? The vision of this is going to be a tool that's going to provide you as an analyst complete data awareness. Whatever tool you're working in, we're going to highlight things that are important to you and we're going to pull that information in and make it available to you. And the important part of this is that you're going to get a lot of feedback. And the important question is, you need to ask people just directly, would you pay me money for this product? Because a lot of people are going to say, hey, that's cool. But just because something's cool doesn't necessarily mean they're willing to fork over cash for it. And so the feedback we were getting on this idea, because at the time we had other competing ideas, we were still trying to decide what were we going to build as the product and spend all our time on. All the feedback we were getting from folks in the field, right, information security professionals, was really positive. And folks would pretty much say, hey, if you're able to build this, and I think a lot of people were skeptical that we'd be able to pull it off, it'd definitely be something I'd want to use. And more importantly, it's something I'd want to pay money for. So we took that, the route of let's advertise the idea. We didn't blast it out on YouTube or on the Twitterverse, but we did meet with a lot of people. We showed them the prototype. We were very open with it. And I know a lot of founders that will want to take the other approach of kind of hiding the idea. But my kind of feeling on that is that, ideas, chances are someone else has had the idea you have. And really what matters is execution on the idea. And ultimately, if all it takes is someone to hear your idea for them to be able to beat you to market and build something better than you could build, I hate to say it, but you probably weren't going to be successful with that idea in the first place. And you might want to move on, you might want to pick a different idea to work on. So for us, it worked out being able to share the idea with a lot of people. And that's how we got that initial feedback. And we're able to tell like, hey, if we're actually able to build this and execute properly, we should be able to sell this as a product.
And then I assume a lot of that kind of gets driven by those initial people who have interest of, what are the things that you need to see to make this sellable as a product?
Well, that's right. Once someone tells you that, yeah, if you build that, I'm definitely interested in buying it. That's the first person you go back to when you finally built it, right? You should at least be able to get a pilot out of it. They're hopefully going to feel guilty enough to at least give you a pilot.
There you go. Guilt. That's a good sales strategy.
But yeah, you talk about how much is customer driven in terms of feature requests. There is an overarching kind of vision for any product that I think founders have, but you have to be very flexible in responding to what your customers are telling you, right? Because ultimately they're the ones you're building the product for. So a lot of the things that you see in Polarity have come from customers, and I think I mentioned this before we started the cast, but integrations were not originally a part of Polarity. There was no integration framework. There was no way for a customer to build their own integrations. And we very quickly realized in terms of the way customers were trying to use the product, that's something that would be very valuable to them and that they would really want. And so, that's one way that the product evolved over time from customer feedback and watching how our customers were using the product.
Sure. And then you have a product and you're kind of ready. Like you're at that point where you have something that you're comfortable selling. Like not in a mean way, but like as a bunch of nobodies, like how do you even try to go to market with something like that? Like how do you start getting channels out to even talk to people about it? Like, because that's got to be one of the hardest parts of doing something like this, right? Have the best idea in the world, but if you can't tell people about it and you can't get a hold of people to tell, what do you do?
Yeah, so we were, it is very difficult. So I mentioned, the product development started back in 2014. And we kind of worked on it in stealth mode from 2014 to 2016. So during that time, we did have some customers that were very supportive of what we were doing. They were providing us a lot of great feedback. And we decided to kind of show off the product at Black Hat in 2016. So Black Hat had that Innovation City. We got one of those little kiosks and they had everybody on the main floor all together there. And so that was the first time we were kind of showing it off to folks. And you just really have to get out there. So when you're at these conferences like Black Hat and RSA, or you're at a B-Sides or a ShmooCon or one of those, you need to just grab people and say, hey, come take a look at this. And I think
first time I ever saw the product was at ShmooCon, actually, like 3 years ago.
Yeah. ShmooCon's local for us. I'm in the DC area and that's a local conference, and Paul has a history with that conference as well. So we were super excited to be there and be sponsoring that and be a part of that. I think the first year we were there, we gave out these little drones that you could win. We always try to come up with like a fun game for folks to play and then do a fun giveaway. I
mean, swag does attract people, right?
It does, yeah. You pick the right swag, and you're going to get people to the table for sure. So there's maybe another lesson learned for startups. Pick the right swag.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say it is very hard, and we were very lucky because my two co-founders, Paul and Joe, had been in the industry for a long time. So before Paul came to government, he had actually worked in the private sector. Joe had been in the private sector as well, in the consulting side of things. So they had a lot of contacts, and they would reach out, they would call folks up and say, "Hey, we've got this product. Would you like to take a look at it?" And I think one of the things that worked in our favor was that the product was really unique. So. It was not, endpoint protection or a threat intel platform. It was different. And so when we were at these conferences, people would stop by and take a look, and they would remember us just because of how different the product was. And that helped a lot.
Oh, I can absolutely imagine that. But one of the interesting things that kind of comes in products and stuff, and you talk about, you kind of started as analysts, like very like security in mind, like for security professionals in mind. And I absolutely use it as a security professional. But like, did you anticipate like the total number of other kinds of use cases that exist? Like you have package tracking in it, for Christ's sakes, which is really cool. But also like were you surprised to find that like you have a decent customer base that exists outside of the security space using it in ways that you might not have originally even intended or thought about?
I think you stumbled onto a constant discussion within the company, and it's around strategy, right? And for a startup, it's what is your target market? For us, we've made that kind of strategic decision to really focus on the information security professional for a couple of what I think are just practical reasons. One, it's our background, so it's what we know, it's what we can talk to intelligently. And it's where we had those initial contacts, right, to get into that industry. I think it's also just a really good fit. So information security professionals work with a lot of data. That data is not very memorable, but that data is also very easy for a machine or an algorithm to recognize. An IP address is very easy to recognize. A hash is very easy to recognize. A domain and email, etc. So I think there are a lot of use cases outside of security. Just a small hop to the left and you've got network operations, very similar type of use cases, even if they're applying it in a different way. And then you've even got things like CRM or sales type use cases. Actually, internally, we use it a little bit for sales. We have an integration with Salesforce. So if somebody's email shows up on your screen, you get an email from someone, you can know right away, are there any support tickets for that person? Have we talked to them before because information from Salesforce is getting pulled in? But right now we're not actively pursuing those, but we do have customers come to us, and when customers come to us and propose a use case, we're always happy to support it.
Yeah, I would be surprised if it doesn't catch on outside of just like the information security side, just because there's so many practical use cases to like basically condensing that tribal knowledge and that ability. On that vein, any last thoughts or tips or like lessons learned from the startup world before we jump back in to talk more about the tool itself?
Yeah, I kind of talked about picking good co-founders. I would really not start a company by yourself. I think that it'd be so difficult. I've really leaned a lot on my co-founders, and having folks to bounce ideas off of is super important. I mentioned I'm a proponent of socializing your idea, whatever that idea is, and trying to get that feedback early and continuously. This one is actually a tip that Ron Gula gave. Ron Gula is on our board. For folks that don't know, he's a co-founder of Tenable along with his wife, Cindy Gula. And Ron kind of brought up something that I think is just so simple, but people probably don't think about it, which is, define your goal. We touched on this in terms of what is it that you want to get out of starting a company. And it's important to be very honest with yourself. So if you want to become a billionaire, you should be honest with yourself and say, I want to become a billionaire. And the way you would run your company and the things and decisions you would make to try to get to be $1 billion company are going to be very different than if you're starting that lifestyle company, a services company versus a product company, for example, or a company that you plan to work at for the next 20 and 30 years and retire from and pass down to your eldest child or something along those lines. Those are going to be very different ways and decisions that you're going to be making along the way. And so it's important that you know ahead of time what it is your goal is. And then, maybe the last two, I would say don't prematurely optimize processes. So, don't let, if you're a perfectionist, try to embrace good enough. That's always been a challenge for me. You want to move quickly. And then another, probably an obvious one is just when you're hiring people, make sure you're hiring people that share your same values. Make sure you're hiring people that are smarter than you, right? That are bringing something to the team that they can do better than anybody else on the team that you have.
I'll add one other one, and this is just an observation of working with y'all over some time. Have great customer service if you have anything that relates to a customer. And I can say these guys have phenomenal customer service, but like if you're not known, it's so important to make that impression, like in a good impression with somebody, and be responsive and be understanding and like really work with the customers, right? Any elaboration?
And it works both ways, right? If you're going to have a better experience from a vendor perspective, you're going to have a better experience with your customers if your customers know that you're always going to go the extra mile and go out of your way, and they're going to be more forgiving, if you will, when a problem does arise. Because no matter what, in any product, if it's built using software, there's going to be an issue at some point. And you want to be in a position where your customers are going to be, understanding about that, and they're going to know that you're going to be doing whatever it takes to get that resolved.
Oh yeah, problems are going to happen. And you mentioned Rangula, and that actually brings up one kind of last question in this vein, because I think this is one that, at least like for me, like it's just not something that I fully understand. How does one even go about the concept of finding funding or investors? Like, what does that even look like? Because that seems like such a completely untouchable kind of thing, unless you like want to go on Shark Tank and make an ass out of yourself.
I should get Paul to come on, because he did the brunt of this work, but it's a job in and of itself. It's going to take longer than you expect, no matter what, and you're going to get rejected a lot, right? And I think maybe one of the hardest parts of it is that it's never really outright rejection. It's sort of the soft no. You'll get a lot of soft no's. And so what it is it's just, you just have to keep going at it over and over. You're going to be introducing yourself. You're going to want to do a lot of research on the folks that you are thinking about approaching and pitching them on your idea. There's a lot of resources online in terms of like putting together a pitch deck or things like that. I know Ron actually, I think it got canceled because of the whole coronavirus thing, but he was going to do kind of a pitch competition type event. So there's things like that going on that you should look into. I'm sure there are meetups for entrepreneurs and whatnot, but it's just a lot of just reaching out, and oftentimes it's going to be cold. You'd be surprised. I was surprised. I'm very much an introvert. Paul is very much an extrovert. So it was very natural for him, I think, to be reaching out to people, but they're very receptive because these VCs are looking for companies to invest in, right? You're not wasting their time as long as you do your homework ahead of time and know what they're looking for and the types of companies they invest in, and you have a plan, because they want to talk to you, because that's what their job is. They're trying to find those companies to invest in.
That's how they make their money, right?
Exactly. And, just like when you're hiring your own employees, when you're looking for, I should say to start, you don't even necessarily have to go the investor route if you don't want to. You could bootstrap your company. If you're doing a services company, you might not go the investor route. You might just do a friends and family round, and that gives you enough money to get off the ground and grow at the rate that you want to grow. That's what we did originally. We raised money from friends and family. It's exactly what it sounds like. You call up your friends, you call up your family, tell them the business idea, and see if they want to throw some money into it. I mentioned earlier, I actually raised some money from my father-in-law. I remember very distinctly the conversation with Paul and Joe when I let them know that my father-in-law was interested in investing in the company. I was actually going to tell them that I don't think it's really a good idea. But they were both so excited. They were like, of course it's a good idea. And I was like, you guys aren't the ones that have to, go to Christmas every year and explain to him why you potentially lost his money. It would be very awkward. Yeah, so it was definitely when we finally finished that friends and family round and had the cash in the bank from my father-in-law included, and friends and family too, right? I mean, that's a huge responsibility, definitely some weight on your shoulder when you're taking money from your friends and family. For me, that really felt like at that point, it really felt like we were all in, right? We had burned the bridge behind us and there was no way to go but forward.
That's fair. So we can totally pivot a little bit more. So, I mean, we talked about what the tool is. We talked about the startup stuff, which it's such valuable information. So thank you. Because it's not often do you get people to be kind of candid about starting a startup and talk through that. So that's really valuable, I think. Let's talk a little bit kind of about, like, we know what the tool is. Like, let's talk about the use cases a little bit. Like, walk me through some of those use cases.
Yeah, absolutely. So, in kind of talking about how the product is used, every team's going to be a little bit different, but, I'll kind of walk through maybe a use case starting with like a vulnerability management analyst, right? So, imagine I'm a vulnerability management analyst and I get an email from some system owner and they're asking me, hey, I'd like to get a waiver. I'm not going to apply these patches to the system because we're going to take that system down next week. And in that email is a CVE number. Now, as that vulnerability management analyst, if I'm running Polarity, that CVE all of a sudden gets highlighted right on my screen. So if I'm in Outlook, the CVE gets highlighted. If I'm in Gmail, the CVE gets highlighted. Again, we don't really care about what the application is because we're working at that pixel level. And then I see that it's highlighted and I say, oh, interesting that we know something about the CVE. I hover my mouse over it and up pops a note. And that note is coming from one of the CTI analysts. So in this case, in our example, the CVE that we're looking at is probably one a lot of folks are familiar with. There's a lot of buzz around it. It's the 2020-0796 or the SMB Ghost vulnerability, which is a vulnerability in Microsoft Server Message Block, SMB version 3. And so all of a sudden you have this insight from the CTI analyst that the vulnerability management analyst knows, right? And that's not a connection that would have been easy to have made before. So what happens is that vulnerability management analyst, they email that CTI analyst and say, hey, one of our system owners is thinking about, doesn't necessarily want to patch this. We're going to deprecate this system next week. What do you think? I saw that you're working on the CVE. And that CTI analyst, when they get that CV on their screen, they're going to, not only are they going to see those same notes, so that's one of the key aspects of Polarity is that we're bringing up other people's notes, but it's also your own notes, right? Something that you might have captured back a week ago. And in this case, maybe you're capturing the link out to Twitter when Microsoft, the Security Response Center, put out a tweet acknowledging that this vulnerability existed, right? And that was pretty recent, I think back in March. But in addition, as a CTI analyst, maybe you have one of our integrations running, for example, with Flashpoint. And because there's now a lot of chatter about this vulnerability, people are saying it's wormable. It's supposed to be a remote code execution vulnerability. So there's a lot of chatter on the dark web about it. All of a sudden, that Flashpoint information is brought up right on your screen. So that CVE is now highlighted in two colors. It's highlighted with the note that you provided, as well as the fact that, hey, there's something here from Flashpoint. You hover your mouse over it and that information comes into that overlay window, and you can now start reading those dark web forum posts right in Polarity. You've never even left that email client. You still have that information available.
It's very important to note that the colors are completely customizable based on integration and/or channel, and it's like playing with a big box of crayons, and it's kind of cool.
Yeah, and we have some kind of guidance on how you would choose those colors. But the colors change the way that things are highlighted on your screen. And what we found is that analysts actually very quickly start to associate colors with specific data sources. So take, for example, something like MaxMind, right? Some IP geolocation information or IP info or something along those lines. You might not want every IP address on your screen highlighted in bright red because MaxMind knows something about it. That's probably not particularly useful. So as an analyst, I would set MaxMind to a light gray color. But if I'm using a tip and I've configured that integration to the tip with Polarity, maybe I want items that are high severity with high confidence. Maybe I want those indicators highlighted in red on my screen so they're immediately brought to my attention. I know I need to dive into that, whatever I'm doing.
Yep. So is there more in this specific use case, or should we talk about some other ones? I feel like you got this whole story set up for this one, and I feel bad for cutting you off.
Oh, no worries at all. So yeah, I can kind of go in here. So we've got this CTI analyst, right? And they're using this Flashpoint integration. And a lot of those forum posts are going to be in a foreign language. And so actually Polarity allows you to pivot on that using a Google Translate integration. So you can actually translate that text right in the overlay window, get those translations. And what's going to happen here is that this analyst is going to see some Python code for a proof of concept exploit for this CVE. And so they're going to go ahead and they're going to start annotating within Polarity some of the strings from the exploit code. So a key point to bring up, and oftentimes folks don't realize this when they get the demo of Polarity, is that we can actually recognize any string. It doesn't have to be an IP address. It doesn't have to be a hash or a traditional indicator. So in this case, maybe you are annotating the specific offset value for the vulnerability, right? So the SMB Ghost vulnerability has a buffer overflow. It's in the compression header. There's an offset field, and there's also like an original file size field, and you can set that to specific values which cause the buffer to be allocated way too small for the payload, which triggers that buffer overflow and a blue screen. So as an analyst looking at this, I might want to highlight those very specific strings that can cause that buffer overflow, right? Because I'm looking at this exploit payload. And at that point, I'm going to want to know, hey, have we seen this on any of our own systems? So we've gone from we know this vulnerability exists. We now know that there is an exploit available for the vulnerability. And now we want to get to, is there something in our environment that might be vulnerable to this, or have we seen this exploit in our environment? And so that CTI analyst is going to rope in that IR analyst and say, hey, can you take a look at some of the systems that we have running? And maybe what you've annotated at this point is your own internal infrastructure. So the term domain controllers comes up on your screen. That gets highlighted. You hover over that, and it pulls up all the IP addresses and host name mappings for your internal domain controllers. Or maybe it's a link that takes you out to a Google Doc where that information is being kept, right? And right in that list, we now have an integration with your ticketing system. So one of those IP addresses gets highlighted because in the last couple of days, the help desk has been putting tickets into your ticketing system, something like ServiceNow, and they've been putting tickets in because that server's been crashing. So you can kind of see here how Polarity in and of itself is not a detection capability. We're not a tool that does detections for you, but what we're doing is we're allowing you as an analyst to have the information you need to make good decisions, to make good analytic judgments, right? To tell that story. I think I mentioned earlier before we started this discussion, what is my opinion on what an analyst is? And, I said an analyst is someone that takes raw data and figures out how to extract intelligence out of it, and then figures out how to tell a story based off of that intelligence. And so what Polarity is really all about is helping those analysts here. In this case, you got that vulnerability management analyst, the CTI analyst, and the IR analyst, figure out what the story is behind what starts off with just the CVE and how to pass this information from team member to team member in a very seamless way.
And then you kind of even come into the I've got these unique strings and I can look for these unique strings. So if any, the CTI analyst might tag that. And then if anybody in the SOC runs into those unique strings, I know what they're related to. So you're basically completing this entire life cycle of communication without communicating because you can't communicate at that level often, right? Or at for every little thing like that.
Well, that's right. Because, you mentioned the SOC analyst, right? Maybe the SOC analyst has to pool network traffic. And they're looking for, traffic going over, port 445 because they're looking for this SMB stuff. And, they pull up their flow logs and they figure out this source and destination IP. And then they pull some PCAP, maybe from Moloch. And they're looking within the PCAP in Wireshark. And then some of that information that the CTI analyst had tagged, right, yesterday or the day before, now starts getting highlighted in the PCAP data, kind of pointing out that, hey, this part of the payload is indicative of this particular POC exploit that is tied to this CVE. And these analysts are not directly linked to each other necessarily. So that's what makes communication between them so difficult. It's what makes, in the real world, it makes it so difficult for that SOC analyst to be able to communicate, all the way back to what that vulnerability management analyst was looking at.
Also, nice shout out to Moloch. Appreciate that.
Yeah, I thought I had to work that in there. I don't know. Maybe
totally
you guys will be the first to build the that open source Moloch integration with Polarity,
right?
If not, we'll build it for you.
There you go. So I think that really kind of breaks down a lot of what this looks like and kind of how that's functional. It is customary for us to have our guests bring a detection for everybody, and I'm going to hand it off to Mr. Exiled to talk about, or to kind of walk through that process and do the detection. Exiled, are you still with us?
Oh yeah, I'm here. I was actually thinking, all my time working with analysts, with all cool tools like this, the other thing analysts are really good at doing and wanting to take part in are pranks and trolls. So
we've used this system. I have in the past used this system for things of that nature as well. So
I'm wondering if Ed, do you do anything like that to pass notes internally or troll one another using Polarity internal to yourselves?
It definitely happens. Yes, you'll find that your name gets tagged quite often. You'll know who did it though. And you can ignore that if you want, so the system allows you to ignore it. It's definitely most common during our onboarding sessions. Folks like to have a lot of fun then, and then most folks tone it down a little bit once the system's deployed and being used for actual professional work.
I'm starting to get a little curious as to like if anyone has picked up a nickname that got stuck in a Polarity system and it's stuck around for a while.
I mean, we have some interesting tags for like analysts who have found stuff, and like I've seen that been used before. But I think the most interesting one that I had, and I will tell this story. This was kind of during a testing process that I'd done for Polarity at one point in my career. Somebody tagged OK Boomer. And somebody put a GIF in a chat channel that said OK Boomer on it. And all of a sudden that was highlighted. And that's how everybody found out.
Nice. I like
that. Was a good one.
Yeah.
We all had a good laugh. And that's also how we found out that it worked on animated GIFs.
Well, and that's a good thing for the tool too. If people like it enough that they embrace the levity and humor, you leveraging the tool. So that's a good sign.
The upside of having as many channels as you want is you can have a whole channel just for humor.
Yeah, there is a role-based access control, so if you need to segregate the troublemakers into their own channels, that can definitely be done.
And that'll definitely be understudy and I from the beginning, just for people's own sanity.
Oh, I'm definitely a troublemaker. But go ahead, XL, take us into the detection.
So Ed, what we normally do, we have to stick with the name of the podcast, we have a detection section, and that's basically something people can take to work right after they listen to the episode and start to put it into application. So like things we've done in the past are like techniques on how to detect C2, things like that. So we leave it to our guests as kind of like the Welcome to Detections podcast. Now, here you go. Give us a detection, something that our listeners and we could use at work, leveraging the tool, not leveraging the tool, but something to help us apply what we've been talking about.
Yeah, so I'm going to actually go back to a true story early on in the company's foundation. So Polarity had been built at this point. We had some customers, and the tool at this time, there was no integrations or anything like that. It was really just the annotations. You could just take some notes in. So one of our customers, they had a team that was working on figuring out how some IP had been stolen. They had some intellectual property. That intellectual property had been taken, and they needed to figure out, how that had happened. So they wanted to know if their mitigation and remediation efforts were going to be effective. And if you can't figure out how you've been hacked, that becomes very difficult to kind of determine that. And so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to kind of walk through the story. I think it's a pretty interesting story. Hopefully there's some lesson learned in terms of defenders working and defending their own networks. And there's a small tie into Polarity, but it's actually not really, I think it's going to show the benefit of being able to tie different things together that you might not have done in a manual fashion. But hopefully it makes people stop and think about how, we could tie things together that we might not have previously thought to tie together. So the first kind of step in this story, right? We have the IP that was stolen, and we were pretty lucky. The team that was working on this was pretty lucky, because the IP only existed in a few places within the infrastructure. And they pretty quickly narrowed it down to a server that was internet facing. It was a web server. It had an app on it that folks could log into, and that server was internet facing. And so, you pull those web logs, you put them into your search platform of choice, a Splunk, an Elasticsearch, whatever you like to use. And they started looking for that anomalous behavior. And the problem was that there was a lot of user accounts accessing that server, and a lot of those user accounts were accessing that confidential IP. But all of those accounts, when they were brought up for review, were accounts that you would expect, based on the role, to be accessing the IP itself, right? So there was really no behavior there within the web logs that was anomalous. So it was a bit of a dead end. With just the web logs, there was really not enough there to make any determination about which account, if any, had a hand in the IP theft. So at this point, kind of the focus turned to these SSH logs. Again, these SSH logs, along with the web logs, all put into this a searchable platform. And if you've looked at SSH logs before, for a server that is internet accessible, you're just going to see all kinds of opportunistic attacks against it. There's just a lot of noise to get through. And so what the team was doing was they were going through all of this, and they made a list of IP addresses where IP addresses that never had any successful authentication attempts. So this would be addresses attempting to authenticate to SSH, but never doing so successfully. SSH login attempts that look like brute force. So, if you have the SSH logs, generally pretty quickly you can tell. If you have flow logs, generally pretty quickly you can tell whether or not something looks like an SSH brute force. As far as, connections coming from a single source IP with, incrementing ports going to that same port 22 on that target machine. And then finally, they were grabbing all the IPs that had been attempting to log in with invalid account names. So they've got this list of IPs. And the problem is that none of this behavior, while it's all bad behavior, none of it is anomalous. It's all expected when you have that SSH server sitting out there. But what they did is, in this case, they had Polarity and they just annotated all those IP addresses. So they just bulk imported them into the system and annotated them all with whatever sort of bad activity they were doing. And then again, kind of stuck because, nothing really stood out that might tie the SSH server logs back to those web server logs. And so the team managed to get their hand now on the third set of logs that they had were VPN logs. And initially, those were kind of deprioritized because the VPN had two-factor on it. And it was kind of the general feeling was, well, if there's two-factor on it, very unlikely that the VPN was compromised and was the source of the compromise. But at this point, we get the VPN logs. We're looking at those. And again, nothing particularly suspicious in the VPN logs. All the traffic is coming from geolocations that you would expect a big city where you're expecting the remote workers to be logging in from. There was nothing, foreign traffic or foreign IP traffic coming in. All the traffic was coming in from your typical 9 to 5. And while you were seeing failed login attempts on the two-factor part, again, that's fairly normal, right? People fat finger in the two-factor code. It times out. They forget their phone. They don't know where it is. Again, it times out. But what happened in this particular case, the analyst that had been assigned to run the VPN logs and review those was different than that analyst looking at the SSH logs. But because they were running Polarity, one of the IP addresses was actually highlighted on their screen. So in this kind of sea of VPN logs, one IP was highlighted. And it turns out that IP address was the same IP address from the SSH logs that had been attempting to log in unsuccessfully. So it had actually been annotated with multiple failed authentication attempts and then just the string admin because it was trying to log in with the admin account. So now we've got this connection between the SSH logs and the VPN logs via an IP address. And so that analyst who was looking at the VPN logs, they basically started just tagging everything related to that particular IP and what they could get out of the VPN logs. So in this case, it was user agent string was the key thing that they had annotated. Also, because they're VPN logs, they were also able to get the account. It actually turned out to be an LDAP account belonging to one of the employees. And now with that information, they were able to go back to the web logs and they actually had something to go off of. So the first thing they did, they went back to the web logs, now filtering on that user account that they have, that they saw trying to log into the VPNs through the IP that was now associated with the unauthenticated attempts via SSH. And they pulled down those web server logs. And sure enough, as soon as they pulled and filtered the logs on that user account, the user agent string that matched with the VPN popped in Polarity. So Polarity actually highlighted that user agent string on the analyst's screen. And so very quickly now they were able to associate the web server logs with the VPN logs through the user agent, and the VPN logs were associated to the SSH logs through the IP address. And what's kind of cool here, these actors that were behind this were, definitely planned and more sophisticated than your typical opportunistic attack, because the infrastructure that they were using to actually steal the IP was completely separate from the infrastructure that they were using to probe the SSH server and the VPN server. So there was actually no connection as far as IP addresses go between the web server logs and the VPN and SSH logs. So if all you were doing was trying to find an IP address that appeared in all three of them, you would have never found that. It really came down to the connection of the IP between the SSH and VPN logs. And again, because this was being looked at by two different analysts, Within the context of the VPN logs itself, nothing suspicious. Within the context of the SSH logs themselves, nothing suspicious, but not until you could put those two things together could you find something. And then going back to those web server logs, that user agent string match is kind of the mistake, one of the mistakes that the attackers made by not changing that when they were probing those SSH server and VPN servers. And so kind of wrapping up that story, ultimately what was determined was that user account, the machine that user was using that had been logging into the web server had been compromised. So they pulled up, they got the forensic image. It took a little while. It was a bring your own device employer. So getting access to all the systems that employee had took some time and getting the forensic images. But it was basically determined that the compromise actually came from the web server account credentials being compromised on that user's machine. And what they found out afterwards when they did the timeline analysis was that the VPN and SSH probes came after the IP was stolen. So what had happened is that when the IP was stolen, the attackers got greedy, and there was information within that IP that gave them good guesses as to what might have been the SSH password, as well as information on kind of internal infrastructure. And so that's after the fact. They had already gotten the IP. That's when they started probing the SSH server. And these attackers were smart enough to do it in a way that would just fit in with the normal noise you would expect from opportunistic attacks. So that's kind of that story you're trying to weave between these three different types of logs with the, above average sophistication actor who's trying to cover their tracks by using clean infrastructure. It goes without saying that the IP addresses they were using were not flagged by anything, were not being blocked by any of the customer's infrastructure, was not in the threat intel platform. One of the benefits of having all these great open source data sources to check is that you have these great open source data sources to check, but the bad guys can check those too, right, to see if things are flagged in them. And so, these kind of better than above average attack where they were able to use this clean infrastructure and made it very difficult to correlate these different logs together. But by having something like Polarity that is able to highlight those things of interest, that intelligence of interest on the analyst to screen, it really kind of directs their attention to the things that matter and cuts through the noise.
Yeah, absolutely. And you made a couple of very key points there that when I would train analysts, when I was in a lead analyst role, that I tried to make sure everyone understood was just because you see one IP conducting a scan doesn't mean it's going to be the same IP doing other aspects of the attack, right? So you mentioned that in the story that they were using multiple IPs for multiple aspects. And the other thing was that they did make a mistake, right? So eventually, because it is humans conducting these things, all we really need the defenders is to find that one string, like the user agent string in your story, or to have them make a mistake, and boom, you're now all caught up.
That's right. Yep. You're looking for those mistakes. And, I think with information security in general, with a lot of analytic work, there's also that little bit of serendipity involved. Are you looking at the right thing at the right time? And, what's important for an analyst is having that data awareness, because in this case, the intelligence that the analyst needed to come to the right conclusion was all there. The correct logs had been collected, and everything, the pieces of the puzzle were there. The analyst just needed help putting kind of the puzzle together with the pieces that they had.
Yes, absolutely. And I think it's interesting, too. Our last special guest was a licensed private investigator, and now we have someone that actually did real intelligence analysts. So I think we got a trend here going, Mr. Understudy.
It's possible. I mean, Ed's not the first intelligence analyst that we've had, though, if we think back to Andrew Thompson.
No, it's not. But back to back like this,
right?
We've got to keep up this trend.
Oh, yeah. So
Thanks
we covered a lot of information tonight, and we're getting close to that point to wrap up. But there's actually really one more really important question for Ed. So, Ed, how do people find out more? Where do they go? What do they do? If an analyst hears this and is really interested in Polarity and wants to know more, and he tells his boss about it, and all those dominoes line up, what do people do? How do they get in contact?
You just go to polarity.io. That's our website. And if you go to polarity.io/detections, there's a free trial you can sign up for to try out the platform. We're going to, of course, know that you're coming from the Detections podcast. So every customer's special, but you'll be extra special.
Look at that, man. People doing nice stuff for us and things. That's so cool.
It feels weird.
I know, it's so weird. You're the second person to do special, nice stuff for us. That's so freaking cool. And honestly, as somebody who's been using the product for a while, I honestly, especially with a 30-day free trial, give it a shot. It's so pivotal to my whole analysis process at this time.
I definitely wanted to check it out to see if I can put it into my single glass of pain tool set.
Right? I mean, it is a lot of my single glass of pain tool set. At this point, it's a really pivotal tool for me. Ed, that's so freaking cool. You really caught me off guard with that, but thank you so much. That's such a nice thing to do for listeners.
Thank you. And I know understudy that I think we owe you a challenge coin at some point here.
If you ever make them,
we haven't forgot about that.
However, we're eventually going to make Detections ones that are only going to go to supporters and guests. So I'll owe you a Detections one too, now that you've been on here.
I'll be honored and excited to accept that.
So, Exile, take us out, man.
Awesome. Thanks again, Ed. Greatly appreciate your time, all the information. I'm sure there's plenty of questions. My brain already has some other questions, so maybe we can continue the conversation on Twitter, social media, some other place like that. But yeah, that's it for today at Detections Podcast. So remember, take this information, do your thing to go forth and find badness.